Over the years, I have developed a healthy relationship with trees. I mean, not in a creepy way, I assure you. I just like trees and looking at them and, well, appreciating their beauty. Again, not in a creepy way. I don't touch them. It's totally in a spiritual way, and also it's good for my mental health, right? At least that's what I've told the police. Anyway, not sure if you also do this as well, but I've made a few tree friends and I've given them names. For instance, right there's Sir Bark a Lot, and right over there it's Elizabeth Branch Ford, and there's more of an acquaintance than a friend, right? I don't really trust that tree. It's Allen, Woody Allen. Oh, but there's also Twiggy the Twigster and Timberlin, and on my left there's Sean Beam, and to my right it's Lady Hardwood and her husband Ed, which she dearly calls him Softwood. There's Lorando Blooms, Keanu Leaves, and Gorman Treeman, and Vanessa with the big shrub right over there, and Vine Diesel, and behind me it's Bob. Anyway, hello my dear friends, welcome and thank you for joining me here today. I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to talk about the religion of the Celts. This video today is a sort of introduction to these studies, so there's quite a lot to say before jumping into the religious aspects of Celtic and Celticized peoples. There's quite a lot to take into consideration because, well, just like with the studies I've been doing and developing here on this channel concerning Old Norse society and belief systems, there's plenty of romanticisms as well, and misinformation, misconceptions, and quite a bit of propaganda revolving around the Celts, even more than what we deal with when it comes to the Vikings. The so-called Viking Age, just to put things into perspective, was little less than 300 years, and if we take the whole of Scandinavian Iron Age with a particular focus on the Vandal period, which gives us quite a lot of very beautiful artifacts, and being a period extremely rich in animal art, which undoubtedly had a profound influence on what would be developed in the Viking Age. But well, the Scandinavian Iron Age was about 1,300 years more or less, and even so, when it comes to the pre-Christian Nordic belief systems, the usual focus is on the period that spanned for little less than 300 years, as I've said. And even so, the misconceptions, lies, inventions, and propaganda are too many and so deeply rooted that it has taken several decades of intense academic work, and we still aren't close to reach a point in society where people are ready to leave behind the fantasies about the Vikings. Now, as you can imagine, with the Celts, for a longer period of European history and a larger geographical reality and the huge diversity of languages and cultures, misconceptions and misunderstandings are far greater, and the Celtomania phenomenon with all its fantasies highly overshadows what we actually know about the Celts. To put it in a very simplistic way, what we call Celtic paganism has spanned 1,000 years over the entirety of the European geographical reality, and yet, as of the taping of this video, and frankly over the next 50 years, to be generous and hopeful, it is still little known today. And this may come as a surprise to quite a lot of people, and you are not alone, mind you. Definitely you are not alone in that, as in my first steps towards paganism over 20 years ago, my first approach with what is given to us as Celtic paganism, as it is far closer to home. However, practically everything we learn about the belief systems of the Celts, their religions and such, is pure fantasy, fabricated through the Celtomania phenomenon, of which I have spoken just a little bit on previous video to put things into perspective, which you can see right here in your right upper corner. So the first thing to be taken into consideration is that Celt was never a term applied to an ethnic group, much less to a homogeneous culture. In a more simplistic way, and to start to have a better comprehension of the Celtic cultural phenomena, we could put it into a perspective of several different tribes, for a lack of a better term, scattered all over Europe, but mostly on the western half of Europe, which shared particular cultural and linguistic aspects which made them Celts. However, of course, the term tribe has its own problematics, which I will not delve into that today. Now, Celts were not a people, but several peoples in the sense of populations, adopting specific cultural aspects that we, as modern people observing what several different cultures left behind during the vast historical period of European late Bronze Age and Iron Age, we would immediately call Celtic of origin. So, certain peoples became Celticized instead of being Celts. I've pointed that out several times on other videos, right? So let me give you a quick example. I live in Portugal, a country which has had an extensive history of Celtic cultures as well. And to this day, there are still many surviving Celtic celebrations and traditions, or rather, better still, celebrations which have certain beliefs shared by many Celticized peoples, especially in the northern part of the country. I have done a couple of videos about that in the past. In fact, it's worth mentioning that past historians have always pointed out Central Europe to be the birth of Celtic culture. However, in northern Portugal and northern western Spain, Galicia, we already find several Celtic-type cultural aspects, including architecture, religion, and artifacts during the Bronze Age, several centuries prior to Celtic cultures of the Iron Age in Central Europe. In fact, looking at pre-Christian Irish mythological content and folklore, and looking at Iron Age history of Ireland, there are quite a few similarities with northern Portugal and northwestern Spain in terms of mythological, folkloric, and, well, several other cultural aspects. A lot of researchers naturally get confused by these historical aspects, and there's often the question, why is there Celtic artifacts and architecture in Western Iberian Peninsula before the appearance of the Celts? In fact, if you go into the National Museum of Archaeology in Lisbon, you will find quite a lot of torques and other golden jewelry from Iron Age Portugal, which you will immediately see the similarities with Celtic jewelry and the famous torques placed around the neck. But these are actually artifacts from before the supposed Celts. Also, much of the Celtic jewelry found in the British Isles, the gold used to make these pieces of jewelry came from Western Iberian Peninsula, particularly from what is now Portugal, which means that the peoples of the British Isles not only have an intense trade with the peoples of the Iberian Peninsula, but the Celtic jewelry found in the British Isles, it's quite possible that these pieces of jewelry were manufactured in the Iberian Peninsula and sold to the peoples of the British Isles. I mean, it's undeniable that the peoples of the British Isles have been influenced by Celtic cultural aspects, which makes them Celts at a certain point in history, as they have been Celticized or Celticized themselves as well. And for the case of Ireland, most Irish researchers and historians nowadays have been avoiding the terms Celts and Celtic to refer to their pre-Christian history, preferring terms such as Irish culture and Iron Age Irish culture or Iron Age Ireland, because we are dealing with peoples from within the geographical reality of Ireland, which in terms of ethnicity and culture, they were not Celts and Celtic, but rather Celticism was a cultural and linguistic phenomenon adopted by many different peoples, to the point that the Celts did not actually exist and no one called themselves Celts, but rather several different cultures and several ethnic groups that shared several cultural aspects and language systems, which in the eyes of outsiders and in the eyes of people like us, very distant to them, in time and merely observing what they left behind, would call them Celts. And Ireland isn't the only geographical reality. We should try to avoid terms such as Celt and Celtic when speaking of their pre-Christian and or pre-Roman history. We should try to avoid this concerning the whole of the British Isles and, for that matter, almost everywhere else, and only using Celts and Celtic as a broad term when dealing with cultural and linguistic aspects that share the same roots in terms of cultural and societal aspects, and not as an ethnicity. And as you can see, I am focusing a little bit here on the British Isles because the great majority of studies on Celts are only focused on the British Isles, despite Celtic influences having reached the British Isles quite late in history, to the point that virtually there were no Celts in continental Europe by the time peoples of the British Isles were Celts or were being Celticized. And this is another problem when we only deal with Celts from the British perspective, as if Celticism originated there, which leads to a bunch of nonsensical rubbish, as we see in maps portraying the Celtic nations, which almost always revolves around the British Isles or the extreme west of Europe. But for good reason, mind you. It is a mistake, it is a misconception, but not without reason. The Celtomania phenomenon, that is an extensive obsession over the Celts and such historical aspects of the European past, started in the British Isles. And everybody fantasized about being a Celt. And New Age religious movements have helped to consolidate this Celtomania phenomenon, particularly through Wicca, originating in England as well, and constructing a total fantasy around Celticism and Celtic paganism and whatnot. How deeply biased the educational system is in terms of the history of the Celts, when the first thing people associate the Celts with are the peoples of the British Isles, mainly this vague idea from Bronze Age and Iron Age Scotland and Ireland. Virtually anyone could be a Celt because people were Celticized to a certain extent, especially in language, but several other cultural factors, including in terms of some agrarian animistic beliefs and yearly celebrations that mark solstices and equinoxes, and other cultural aspects, including in terms of religions and belief systems. But the Celtic influences only reached the British Isles almost 1,000 years after other Celtic cultures had already been developing and close to an end in continental Europe. For a better understanding of certain cultural aspects, mainly the linguistic aspects and in architectural and artifactual cases, and mythological content as well, the term Celt has to be used. Celt and Celtic becomes an aiding term to point out specific periods and geographical realities and their cultures. Although perhaps we should indeed refer to some cultures as having been Celticized rather than being Celts. Even so, since being a Celt was not being a specific people, but in fact adopting several cultural aspects, including religion or religious aspects, language and architecture, I see no problem in addressing specific peoples of certain periods as Celts, since they were very much Celtic precisely for adopting such cultural aspects and having been Celticized. But again, we should be aware that we are not dealing with an ethnic group or a single culture or a single language. And one of the main roots of these problems when studying the Celts and who they were and where they have come from comes mainly from the inability of modern people to see past their own cultural reality and their own modern notions of country and or nation. A great deal of these studies, and not just speaking about the Celts, mind you, is that the studies are conducted within the borders of a modern country or a sense of nation or a unification of nations. The studies on past peoples are often visualized within the modern borders of a given country by the people of that country. As an example, many people are surprised why the history of Paleolithic to the Bronze Age in Portugal is so similar to the same historical periods of Norway. Just because there's a country named Portugal and another country named Norway, this doesn't mean that several other cultures in several other different periods have the same modern sense of fictional landscape borders that mark the limit of a territory. People of the past had their own notions of territorial borders, and people were on the move, were interacting with each other, were losing and gaining territory all the time. And ideas and conceptions move a lot more than people do. This is the same thing when late 19th century to the first half of the 20th century Germany would find swastikas in Iron Age urns within their territory, and everywhere else a swastika was found, they would immediately jump to the conclusion that Germanic peoples had been there. This is something that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever today, and it is even laughable and pitiful, but the same mindset is still found today within academia. People find a Celtic-like artifact in Turkey, and the conclusion is that the Celts were there. Maybe they were, and it is possible because anyone could be a Celt, provided that they spoke a Celtic language and their daily life was composed of or by strong aspects that are found in the Celtic, found to be Celtic in nature, especially taking into consideration cultural aspects and belief systems. But it is also possible that Celtic artifacts were bought and sold and traded and ended up there. It's the same thing we do nowadays with practically anything we buy. Just because we have IKEA furniture at home doesn't mean that Swedish people are living at our home. However, future archaeologists in 1,000 years from now may think that if their only source of information about IKEA is that it was Swedish in origins, and through that also they have surely populated the entire world, because Swedish furniture is found in many homes all over the world. So indeed, instead of Celtic, in the future we would have the IKEAs, and the IKEA people and culture, which were a people with a massive global empire, proven by the furniture found in archaeological cases of domestic environments. Right? Again, to put it in a simple way, but it is definitely not as simple as this, the definition of Celt is a person speaking a Celtic language. There wasn't one single Celtic language, but many. The Celtic cultural world was a series of different tribes and peoples occasionally making affiliations, and such peoples shared specific cultural factors that made them Celt in the eyes of those who did not share those cultural factors. A Celt was anyone sharing a Celtic-based language or dialect and religious, architectonic, artifactual, and social structural similarities, making them Celt from the part of those who were not inserted in such cultural similarities. I mean, the earliest surviving mention of the Celts comes from the works of Herodotus, 5th century before the Common Era. He called Celts anyone outside the Hellenic cultural world and outside the Greek colonies. To him, Celts lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. Hence, modern Portugal and parts of Spain are often considered Celtic as well. And also because the vast quantity of archaeological sites and discoveries as well in Portugal. He, Herodotus, also knew that the river Ister, the Danube, rose in the land of the Celts, for instance. Ephorus, a Greek historian of the 4th century before the Common Era, saw Celtica, a sort of nation, as including most of Iberian Peninsula. Strabo, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, extended the notion of Celtica into modern-day France, making Celtic a name for both the known Celtic cultural world as well as Gaul. And then Julius Caesar abandoned the notion that Celts were in the Iberian Peninsula and Central Europe, and declared Gaul to be the homeland of the Celts, dividing it into 3 parts. He identified Gaulish as Celtic. Basically, the idea of Celts were all the others classical authors came in contact with in Western Europe outside the classical cultural world, which also means that peoples from the British Isles were also included in the Celtic family by classical authors. The term Celt remains, and it's often misleading, as in the 19th century nationalist European politics, well, it was used to create a notion, a false one, of a race. Hence, the wrong idea that being a Celt was a question of ethnicity. Celt was simply a term used by classical authors to refer to various European ethnic groups that spoke a Celtic language, with similarities in language and also similarities on a cultural level different from the classical cultural world. To draw a more comprehensive picture, it's like saying nowadays Americans. An American isn't an ethnic group, but various ethnic groups that share they share the same languages or basis of a language and are more or less inserted in the same cultural identity. Although the Celts never had a nation or a specific country, and the peoples that have been labeled as Celts never actually called themselves or identified themselves as Celts, as they had their own cultural identifications. Again, they were called Celts by classical authors and not by other Celts or by themselves. Early Greek geographers had only a vague idea of European geography and were content to lump together most of the barbarians of Europe from the Middle Danube to the Atlantic as Celts, even though there were others within these regions who were not Celts, as other peoples existed, who did not even share the same cultural patterns, nor did they speak a Celtic-based language, and still they were thrown into the same bag of Celts by classical authors. Celts derives from, as you know it, Keltoi. It is a general purpose term made by the Greeks to refer collectively to the disparate barbarians outside the Hellenic cultural world, and later the term was also used by Romans for the same purpose. Other classical writers used the terms Kelto, Kaltai, and Gali, Galatai, as though they are interchangeable. The variety of ethnic groups caused an ethnic confusion to classical historians. Thus, for some classical writers, Celts, and later with Julius Caesar also Gauls, was used as specific terms to place under one specific meaning for a better understanding of classical historians a variety of different ethnic identities. So this really had to be said once again. And as given what I've just said here, obviously the religion of the Celts wasn't homogeneous either. It wasn't one single religious reality. This is important to state because we often hear about Celtic paganism and Celtic religion when it comes to New Age religious movements, mainly from neo-pagan ones, which have a huge influence on people's perception of history, but more often than not, we are dealing with fantasies and misconceptions. And people are also misled when there's those advertisements on the internet to make a DNA analysis and find out if you are a Viking or a Celt or whatever. I've here spoken about the term Viking, and even though it has been difficult to finally show that Viking was not an ethnic group and no one has Viking DNA or Viking blood, when it comes to the Celts, it is even more difficult because the fantasies around the Celts are far more easily manufactured, and such historical realities are far more easily manipulated because it is a vast historical, temporal, linguistic, archaeological, and geographical reality. To say that someone has Celtic DNA or Celtic ancestors is extremely vague and is the same thing as saying that you have a huge diversity of ancestry of people. In 99% of the cases, we have absolutely no idea by which names and terms they identify themselves with, but certainly they did not call themselves Celts. The people outside the ancient Greeks and Romans politically and militarily controlled geographical areas were called Celts, when not by the more derogatory term barbarians. The classical world tended to think of these Celts as a single society, but the reality was quite different. Let's say a patchwork, as it were, of tribes and peoples. Of course, the peoples called Celts by classical authors shared much linguistically and culturally speaking, but they were never one nation, or as some modern authors have put it, an empire. These peoples span from the extreme west of the Iberian Peninsula, along the Atlantic, all the way to the east as far as Bulgaria, and up north into the British Isles and down into the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. So, as it is expected, there were many differences in their religions, not just evolving through time, but quite a lot of local and regional differences in religious terms. So when we talk about Celtic paganism, what we hear about the most are scattered belief systems of the British Isles, namely from Scotland, and information about the Druids of Ireland from medieval sources written long after the Iron Age Druids were gone. There's seldom any focus on other realities, which is understandable. Because if we just look at the extreme West Atlantic area of the Iberian Peninsula during the late Bronze Age and throughout the Iron Age, there are over 1,000 deities alone, which makes things a little bit complicated when it comes to the study of Celtic paganism or Celtic polytheism. The vast and rich reality of the belief systems of this period from one single fraction of this geographical reality makes it quite hard to determine the whole reality of Celtic paganism throughout Europe. But one thing is certain, these were polytheistic beliefs, no doubt. Unfortunately, we lack written sources about such a vast and rich set of belief systems, and we can mostly rely on archaeological findings of the remains of these cultures. And I say mostly, but not just, because we can actually read quite a lot about it from the writings of classical authors. However, such sources are often quite biased, quite noticeable by the hostility of the sources, such as Caesar's accounts. These written sources obviously requires care and cannot be taken at face value. But these written sources have helped us, with the aid of archaeology, to determine some key deities and other religious aspects, as well as deities that were shared by many cultures and common features in the belief systems of the Celts. However, with the lack of primary and original written accounts about these cultures, there isn't much we truly know about the religion of the Celts, which is why most of what we think we know have been inventions of New Age religious movements, as well as nationalist European political movements of the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century. If we look into Caesar's accounts, he did not give the gods of the Gauls their native names, but instead referred to them by their Roman counterparts, claiming that the main deity of the Gauls was Mercury. I mean, Caesar only focused on the Gaulish society, which was also probably not a homogeneous society, and people who did not refer to themselves as Gauls, much less Celts. Be that as it may, quite a great deal on the knowledge of Celtic belief systems comes from these sources on the Gauls alone, especially on the Druids, which later on served as the basis for other late works on similar priestly figures across the Celtic territories. But anyway, more about the Druids on a past video I've done, which by the end of that same video, there's important bibliography which has also helped me to compose this video right here. Anyway, the Gaulish Celts apparently had many images of their gods, but the archaeological evidences for this are sparse and insufficient. It may be that the Celts of Gaul, let's call them that for a better understanding, used wooden statues of their gods, and these materials have not survived. Among the Celts all over Europe, wooden statues were more common, far more common. Although, of course, there are evidences of ones made out of stone, but that only became more common with the Roman conquest. Only from around the 4th century before the Common Era did the Celts start to erect temples in stone with absolutely monumental doorways. So quite a lot has been lost from periods previous to this. It's also possible, as is the case within more animistic societies, there may be quite a lot of representations of entities of all sorts, and outside cultures unbeknownst to these beliefs may think it to be representations of gods and goddesses, but could just as well be representations of many spirit entities, including ancestors. And in certain ceremonies, such representations could very well be purposely destroyed as part of important cyclical rituals. Of course, some scholars dispute all of this and instead believe that the Celtic tribes mostly worshipped in nature and their gods were not personified in human form. I mean, there's a certain romantic view on this, and mostly influenced by New Age religious expressions which have the tendency to turn nature into a more romantic aspect of human life and its cycles. It is true that from the sources gathered so far, many important rituals and ceremonies, as well as other religious expressions among many Celtic cultures, were performed in prominent landscape features such as hills and mountains, and also quite a bit of religious devotion in forested areas, particularly in groves of oak trees. And this is a common feature among many Celts. However, this doesn't mean that the gods were not personified in any form. However, anthropomorphic representations of the gods among the Celts may have indeed been scarce. If we take the example among many Celts and Celticized peoples of the Iberian Peninsula as an example, some deities were indeed represented in zoomorphic shapes, animals, and anthropomorphic forms were a lot more reserved to ancestors, for humans, for instance. But that is not a tendency shared by all, mind you. The evidences we have of Celts from Britain to the Iberian Peninsula and all the way to Turkey, we find mentions of hundreds of thousands of deities by name, albeit many are mentioned only once. There were many gods that were just local or of one particular tribe or group. We have to take into consideration that among some Celts living near a river, for instance, the particular deity of that river would have been important to them, or at least best known to them given the proximity to the area and how such an entity, a divine entity, would express itself in their belief systems. But for Celts far away from that river, such a deity would mean nothing to them, or they would have probably never heard of such a deity. And there's also the case of one single deity known by many names in different places and by different peoples. So a vast quantity of deities' names could be in reference to one single deity. But there were gods that were worshipped across widespread areas, some of which worshipped in completely different geographical areas. Such is the example of Lugos, which many place names throughout Europe make reference to this deity. Lyon in France, it is a place name derived from this deity. Lothian in Scotland, Legnica in Poland, Lugh among the Irish, Lugos in the Iberian Peninsula, of which I would like to make a video of in the future. This is the deity Caesar referred to as Mercury, quite possibly, as this deity's attributes are very similar to Mercury indeed. And it would make sense being such an important deity among the Gauls, as this is a deity found all across Europe within Celtic contexts. We could say this deity is a pan-Celtic god. I mean, not so far from where I'm from, there's quite a bit of evidences to this deity. There is a very peculiar tradition of mother goddesses called matres, which have been found throughout northwestern Europe. They are mostly shown on altars and statues as a group of 3, and they were quite popular Celtic deities that were associated with sacrifice but also with plenty. One of such goddesses in this group of 3 is always depicted with a basket of fruits and vegetables. These have often been characterized as Germanic deities, but they predate such a cultural reality and are extended across many territories, and were particularly important to the Romans, who have continued their cult, and many local goddesses were depicted like so, many of which may have been depictions of ancestral women, human women, who were deified. Other important common features in the belief systems among many Celts and Celticized peoples is the importance of bodies of water, particularly of rivers, seen as paths that could lead into the other world, to the afterlife. So many rivers and streams were sacred and attributed to a particular deity, and this sacredness continued well into the early Middle Ages, actually. Unfortunately, we have absolutely no idea about the cosmological notions of the Celts and structured myths that can paint a perception on the cognitive animistic landscape, but at least we know rivers and streams were extremely important in the religious expressions of the Celts. And what is also a common feature is war, which surely must have been a major aspect in the life of many Celtic tribes. The number of deities with power and prowess in battle and with warlike characteristics is extensive. It's numerous, honestly, because even deities that in their main attributes are not immediately associated with conflict have some lesser characteristics that also gave them the ability to fight or be somewhat connected with conflict and battle. For some Celts, war itself was embodied by a deity, mostly by a goddess, by a feminine representation of war itself. In southern Gaul, it was Andarta. Somewhere in Britain, Borica called out for the aid from Andrast. In Ireland, the Morrigan was a triple goddess who personified the havoc of battle and was particularly concerned with the fate in warfare. Similar characteristics we find in Trebaruna, of the Lusitanians and Celtiberians. So goddesses of conflict and battle with no small amount of power over the fate of the battle itself and of those who fought in such armed conflicts. Much later, in Iron Age Scandinavia, we find quite a similar goddess, Freya. I think many of you may probably be thinking about the horned god and how does such a deity fits into all of this, since it is a god often mentioned in neo-paganism, especially prominent within Wicca, and is often referred as a Celtic deity. Well, there's certainly a lot of images and statues from across Europe representing a man either crowned by a pair of antlers or horns, or indeed having horns coming out of its head. There's a widespread depiction of this figure in early Celtic religious developments, which may not specifically be of Celtic origins, but from early periods, as we have, for instance, a very beautiful and mysterious example of the sorcerer in a cave painting, the cave of the Trois Frères, Ariège, France, probably made around 13,000 before the Common Era. And I would like to tell you that, sorry, if you haven't yet watched my video on the witch religion, I suggest you watch that video because it is about the influences that led to a modern belief in a witch religion of the past, and the figure of a horned man has been a key element in the construction of this belief in a witch religion, in which the alleged group of witches were governed by a male figure dressed as a horned deity. And so through Margaret Murray, she concluded that a witch religion was thousands of years old due to the depictions of this figure, especially the French example here shown before, which, well, it is, of course, and as you shall see in that video, not the case at all. However, the horned man figure has clearly been greatly developed in Celtic contexts. If it was part of some form of pantheon or not, it cannot be determined, and it may not have been a deity, but the continuation of the representation of a prominent human figure within the belief systems of the Celtic world. This figure is often called Cernunnos, the god, which is sometimes, or more often than not, surrounded by animals, especially deer. But it is to be taken into consideration that it may not have been a figure known in every Celtic context, and given the several languages and dialects of Celtic nature, it may have been a figure more prominent in Western Europe, including the extreme west of the Iberian Peninsula, as well as among the Gauls, and quite possibly in what is now central Turkey, as we find the term Karnonos and such other variations within Celtic languages of the Iberian Peninsula, Gaul, and among the Galatians in central Turkey who spoke a Celtic language, Galatian, and Karnonos, the name itself means horns. This deity, being represented as half human but still containing traces of its animal form, is quite curious. My reason to suggest that this may not be a representation of a deity, but rather the representation of a human being, a human person, which may have had a prominent role within the religious expressions among the Celts, is because one of the first cultures to pass through the anthropomorphization of the gods were the ancient Greeks. Among the Celtic cultures, however, especially in periods of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, many deities were represented as animals. And human figures, on the other hand, did represent humans and not deities. If this horned figure, which is often called Cernunnos, is indeed the representation of a deity, we may be in the presence of a religious Hellenic pattern which was adopted by Celtic cultures, which is the beginning of the anthropomorphization of deities, hence this hybrid figure. But since this horned man is a figure that already appears in early Celtic religious developments, it may not be the representation of a deity at first or originally. However, we must take into consideration that when speaking of Celtic religious concepts, we are not dealing with a homogeneous reality. So it is hard to say for sure if we are in the presence of a deity. What is certain is that the natural elements surrounding this figure is a recurrent pattern in the Celtic belief systems, as it is a pattern found within the animistic cognitive landscape, where the natural world plays a fundamental role in animistic belief systems, as nature is part of the daily dynamics of human life. Much of what we know about the ancient Celts comes from outside sources of the Celtic cultures and the reality of their systems of belief. The Celts themselves never wrote down their religious beliefs, with a few exceptions actually. For instance, speaking of the Lusitanians, even though the Lusitanian language cannot be considered a Celtic language, but it is an Indo-European language, it certainly has quite a lot of Celtic terms nonetheless, given the proximity with the Celtiberians, and quite a bit of Lusitanian language and belief systems shared several similarities with Celtic linguistic and religious realities. Now, the Lusitanians, much like many other late Bronze Age and Iron Age European cultures outside the classical world, did not write about their beliefs. at least in surfaces that have survived to this day. However, the early Lusitanian contact with the Latin languages during the early stages of Romanization allowed the Lusitanians to write in their own language using the Latin script, which is why we know about such a language and other indigenous languages of the Iberian Peninsula, as well as Celtic languages and dialects of the peninsula. Now, the Lusitanians used the Latin script to talk about their deities and certain religious expressions towards them. And this allows us to see some religious patterns among such early Iron Age cultures within the Celtic cultural panorama. But as I was saying, much of what we know from the Celts, it doesn't come from the Celts. Earlier sources such as Caesar in his conquest of Gaul mention that the act of not writing anything among the Celts, well, the Gauls in this case, was to stop the spread of the doctrines outside their priestly class, mainly to stop the doctrine of the Druids from spreading outside their own reality and to preserve the skills of those who memorized the lore. According to Caesar, the Druids believed that by writing things down, people tend to forget those things. So the oral tradition was fundamental to memorize the important aspects of the religion. And in a twisted turn of events, this very belief led to the forgetfulness of such important content. What the Druids wanted to be remembered was completely forgotten because they did not write it down to preserve such knowledge. I mean, I think this really shows how harmful such extreme beliefs may be, especially when holding on to traditional beliefs that can only be preserved if evolution of such traditions is allowed. Everything is forgotten if it is not able to accompany the evolution of human mentality. Anyway, I will not focus on the Druids in this video because, well, as I said before, as it was previously mentioned, I have already made a video for the Druids and what we truly know about them. Suffice to say that much of what we know from the actual Iron Age Druids comes from sources on the Gaulish society. For more information on this, check that previous video, if you please, including the Irish case and the Christian Druids. But it seems to me that one of Caesar's aims was indeed to suppress and wipe out the religious beliefs of the Gaulish Druids, which have had a fundamental role in the Gaulish society. Taking down this religious authority was fundamental to penetrate the minds of the Gauls and to bring them into Roman rule by introducing Roman religious authoritarianism. As soon as Gaul was conquered in the 1st century of the Common Era, the Romans immediately set about civilizing the Gauls, and this required the suppression of the Druids. However, it is to be taken into consideration that the Roman Empire did not insist on religious purity. For as long as Romanized peoples also made sacrifices in the emperor's name and presented religious expressions towards the gods of Rome and respected Roman authority, they could keep their own gods, which is why even after Romanization, many indigenous deities and the religious expressions towards them were still kept to a certain extent. But of course, progressively, places of worship among the Celts and other Romanized cultures were soon replaced by Roman temples and shrines, further bringing indigenous societies into the Roman world and their beliefs eventually dying out. But suffice to say that over 1,000 years, Celtic belief systems have changed quite a lot, and not only influenced by earlier cultures and the very changes in cultures and belief systems of each neighboring tribes and peoples, but as the Roman Empire eventually expanded, the ancient Celts have adapted and adopted many aspects of Roman religion and incorporated into their own belief systems and religious expressions, and vice versa. So, my dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed this video and I do hope it was useful. If you have enjoyed this video and made it this far, consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't already, of course, and also consider becoming a patron to help me carry on with this work and this channel as well. Thank you for your kindness and support. Thank you very much for watching and listening, and as always, thanks for today. And until we meet again, my dear friends.